I visualized the language in action and I felt it. And I thought, this is how everyone should learn English, that by feeling, by moving, by acting, by doing, not by memorizing a list of phrasal verbs or irregular verbs, but by feeling it.
Have you ever felt like traditional language learning methods just aren't clicking? You memorize vocabulary, study grammar rules, but something's missing. So what if you could feel the language instead of just memorizing it? This is the key to living your English and not just study it. I have met students who just studied English and that honestly got them nowhere. I've also met people who live their English by connecting it with the things they're already passionate about. And this is how they feel and experience the language. And then, of course, on top of that, they may add some kind of learning routine. And this is how, when they combine these two things, they are the people who are more likely to go on to achieve their English learning goals and English fluency aspirations. So, in this podcast, I had the pleasure of talking with Carolina Ramos. And let me tell you, this is a conversation that really opened my eyes to this whole new way of living your English that I just had never considered before. This is learning English through theater and acting.
I do think I was brought into the language teaching through my passion, which is theater. And I learned so much of the English language by being an actor and having to perform and memorize and learn about character study.
Theater and acting are a fantastic way to learn English by immersing yourself in the language through movement, creativity, emotions, and full body expression. Today, we'll explore the intersection between acting and English learning. And even if acting is not your thing, still stick around because at the end of the day, feeling the language is about connecting it with the things that are meaningful in your life, your passions, your hobbies. And for my guest, this happened to be theater and acting. And also, well, it just so happens that English and acting and theater, they just mix so well. It's like a match made in heaven. You can also connect that thing that you're so passionate about with English. And when you do this and truly commit to it, then that's when the magic starts to happen. And that's an opportunity for you to start living your English and not just learn it like a school subject. So get ready because this is a conversation you don't want to miss. With Karolina and yours truly, let's do this. All right, English hero, you've made a great decision to tune in today because I'm joined by a very special guest, Carolina Ramos. And Karolina, I really appreciate the fresh and creative approach to language learning that you bring to the table. Can't wait to get into all of that, and thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me, Max. It's a first experience for me being in a podcast. So I'm a little bit nervous, but I'm sure that you'll help me through.
Yep, I get the nerves. I've been doing this for a couple months now. I think this is episode, 18? And I still get nervous before hitting record. I still need to take a deep breath in and definitely want to commend you for being here today. And I guess we can start with the basics, right? Would you please share a little bit about yourself, about your background and what you do?
Sure. So I am Carolina, like you said. I am originally from Spain. I have a BA in theater that I studied in the States. I've lived in the States for many years, and I've also worked as an actor for many years in Canada. So I have a mixed background there around the world. One of the highlights of my career was that precisely I traveled around the world performing theater plays for children. So this is where I discovered my passion for education through the arts. And so after that, I wanted to pursue my master's in theater and education, which I did. And of course, as a teacher of English as a second language. And then when I moved back to Spain with my husband, Kevin, we decided to create a school where we would teach English the way I learned English, through creativity, emotions, and connection.
Wow, that's very interesting. And I can see the ESL element in your background there. Firstly, as a learner, but also, going through the experience of living in the United States, probably facing many of the challenges, right, with the process of learning and adapting to living your life in English in an authentic context where English is spoken everywhere. Plus theater, that's really interesting too, and how you now can combine those aspects of your experience and how you're now bringing that into your ESL teaching, English as a second language, of course. And before we get into all the fascinating ways in which you blend drama, humor, and English, I'd love to know what inspired you to bring acting and language teaching together. Was there a specific moment that you can remember when you thought, this is it, this is how English should be taught? Can you take us back to that moment?
Oof. It's difficult to pinpoint a specific moment because I think everything is a process. But I do think I was brought into the language teaching through my passion, which is theater. And I learned so much of the English language by being an actor and having to perform and memorize and learn about character study that I guess even when I was studying Shakespeare, for example, which I use a lot with my students, and it seems to be so intimidating. And it was intimidating for me at first, right? Shakespeare, Old English. Oh, it's going to be so confusing. And so the language was incredibly challenged for me, even when I was bilingual. But everything changed when we were rehearsing one of Shakespeare's plays, Romeo and Juliet, and the director started blocking the scenes. Blocking in theater means when the director choreographs the movement on stage, right? So he tells you where your character should be moving or what your character should be doing when you're saying one thing or another. So he made the words become actions.
All right.
And when I saw that, I made connections with the language and I started understanding the text way more. So as I associated and I visualized the language in action and I felt it. And I thought, this is how everyone should learn English, that by feeling, by moving, by acting, by doing, not by memorizing a list of phrasal verbs or irregular verbs, but by feeling it, which is how children learn the language because they feel it and they feel it through their senses. So I started experimenting in this school that we opened, my husband and I, with children, and how actions with words could have more of an impact in their long-term memory. And later on, neuroscientific studies came up where they actually proved that emotions have a stronger impact in our brain for long-term memory. So I thought, oh, finally, science is proving something that artists have been doing for centuries. And so that's what really kind of guided me towards having our own methodology and creating our own techniques that would apply theater into language acquisition.
That's so good, Karolina. And yeah, I can totally see how the science actually caught up to what you were doing there, because what you're saying makes a lot of sense. And yeah, it's so true. When you're learning vocabulary, I guess it's kind of like an spectrum. How real life-esque is the approach to learning that piece of vocabulary, or on the other end of the spectrum is just, reading off of a dictionary page definition, which there is like a complete disconnect with, as you were saying, an action, something from real life that you can attach to that word, together with the way that you were feeling in the moment, the broader context that in many subconscious ways, it reinforces your understanding and your memory for that specific vocabulary item or any other piece of language that you're learning. And not to say that learning with a dictionary has no use or no place in your broader language learning, but we need to find ways in which we learn English and words and everything about language, right, in an authentic, real-life way. And that just makes learning so much more powerful.
Exactly. This is why I think theater is the closest to a real life experience, because it recreates all of that. And the more you recreate scenarios, the more senses you use. Like, we even teach English with babies. Babies come to our school with their parents, and we use the 5 senses. We do cooking to evoke tastes and talk about what we're eating. We use music, obviously, so which all of the 5 senses need to be involved for your brain to make those connections and learn.
Yeah, and I wish I could retrieve some of the literature that has been put together exactly on that, because I'm sure multi-sensory learning is a thing in ESL and research that has been done on that particular thing. And it actually takes me back to my conversation with Alberto, my previous guest on the podcast, and he talked about how he learned Spanish in a bilingual home, right? He lived in the United States as a kid, and his mother spoke Spanish as a native language. And he told me that he not only learned the language, but also smelled it as his mother prepared dinner, prepared lunch, prepared the typical Spanish foods, which I guess makes your learning so much more robust. And it allows you to really involve the cultural element in a much more authentic way, and, attached to the language in a way that you can only get if you really involve, as you're saying, all your senses. So super interesting. And, at the end of the day, I think when we say real life English or learning English in a authentic context, at the end of the day, that is involving as many of your senses as possible, right? So contrast that with learning English or any language off of a book, right? Which is, again, isolated from the real world in a way, right? And now theater is such a fascinating thing, right? It's like visualizing on a different level, because you're actually acting it out, and you're not just visualizing it with your mind, but you're also involving your body. And you've got a great point there, that's the closest you can get to actually learning English in a context where English is like real life at the end of the day, right? So I'm curious about how acting specifically helped you to learn the language, to become more fluent in English. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, creating characters is not just about memorizing lines, which is in many cases what traditional language teaching does, right? You imitate or you copy sentences, and then you repeat them. And creating a character is not just about learning the lines that character says, but it's learning why they say them and how they connect the thoughts. When you're speaking, your brain is already on the next sentence you're going to say, because your thought pattern goes like that, right? So your brain is speaking, you're speaking, and your brain is working, okay, this is my next sentence, and then boom, you're there, right? It goes very fast. So you have to work your brain, you have to do brain gymnastics to create a character so that the words become part of you. and you ask a lot of questions about that character. So there's all of this inner dialogue going on that I had to create in English. And so in that sense, for the creation of a character, that helped a lot into having my own inner dialogue and having my own voice speaking to myself in English. So I found who I was in that second language. And who I am when I speak in English is not exactly the same as who I am when I speak in Spanish. It's like you adopt a little different identity, you become someone else. And I felt a lot of freedom when I spoke in English, when I was abroad, because I was the only foreigner. I studied in Kansas. There weren't a lot of of people from of international students there. It was just me. In a small university I went, and I felt so fearless because I thought, if I make a mistake, I can go back to Spain. Nobody knows me here. So I was fearless. I didn't mind. And when that fear was out, I opened my mind and I learned so much. So acting made me gain confidence. Then through specific techniques. Now, if we go into the techniques, actors, of course, have to have clarity of speech. So there's a lot of exercises that make you vocalize, articulate, work your mouth muscles so that you prepare before you go on stage, so you don't just mumble your words. So there's a lot of little techniques that can be applied to second language speakers, because we have muscles in our mouth that we don't work the same depending on the language we speak. And it's like when you go to the gym, if you want a biceps, you have to do this kind of heavy weight. So when you work new sounds in your mouth, you have to exercise it. And so acting gave me those two sides, the emotional side and the technical side, that I use now to communicate with my students and to have them practice. Sometimes they get very surprised when I bring up some activities to them, because like, really, you want me to do this? It's like, try it. It's like, but it seems so silly and it's so easy. It's like, yes, it is, huh? But if you do this every day, 2 minutes, you will see how your mouth folds into the melody and the flow of English, and you'll get fluency just by that. And it's so easy. So I don't know if that answers your question, because I know I digress a lot when I speak.
Oh, absolutely, Carolina, absolutely. And, such great perspective. It really does open up my mind to these ideas that I don't usually consider myself, being that I don't have that deep of a background into acting and all the experiences that obviously you have that are pretty unique. But what I'll say is that I can totally see how your students would feel like, Miss Carolina, are you sure you want me to do this? It's kind of silly. It's, I don't know, I feel uncomfortable, which is, I guess, what you're going for in a way, right? Because that means that you are bringing something completely new, completely novel to the students, to the point where they just feel silly, like, do you want me to make a fool of myself doing this or that? And it actually connects with my own experience in a past life. When I was a kid, I think I was 10 years old, I did take a few acting lessons. And I do remember exactly that I felt a bit silly doing some of the activities my teacher want me to do, myself and the group. But I remember, like, once I stopped questioning what I was being instructed to do, I started to enjoy it. I started to embrace more the process of doing all these silly things. I don't remember exactly what they were, but they involved, making voices, funny body movements and stuff like that, jumping, dancing, things like that ultimately led to breaking out of my shell, right? Like starting to feel less timid or shy and just enjoying it, having fun, which ultimately it's what's all about, right? Yeah, the lesson here is follow the lead, right, of your mentor, of your coach, of your teacher, whoever it is that you are working with, and don't always question everything. It's good to have critical thinking, but sometimes you have to actually take a leap of faith and just follow the process and don't overthink things, and that leads to also great things. And when you do that, you're going to find that it's so fun.
It is. It's about letting go and try not to judge yourself, because we're the worst to ourselves.
Our own worst critics.
Maybe others are not judging us like that, and we just create all of these ideas and worries and anxiety, or they're not gonna think I speak perfect English, or I'm not gonna say this sentence like this because the pronoun. You know what? I make mistakes now. When I think too fast and I go too fast and I am in my Spanish side of the brain, I make mistakes all the time. I make them in Spanish too.
They're going to think that I don't speak English perfectly. And, that reminds me of an idea that I've recently come across. It's called the mirror effect. And it's the idea that we often perceive ourselves based on how we believe other people see us, rather than forming our own independent sense of self-image. We kind of like construct our identity by interpreting how we think the other person thinks of us, right? Which is where a lot of the anxiety comes from. And I'm sure it has some evolutionary purpose to think that way. But when you can step out of that, elevate and really become or be yourself, then you get to a whole new place of mastery over yourself and ultimately your English, your fluency, and all those things.
It is, well, it's what makes us as 3D beings. And it's also an approach to character study, right? One of our professors would tell us, give me 3 adjectives to describe your character. One adjective has to be how your character thinks of themselves. Another adjective has to describe your character as others would describe them. And another adjective would be what really your character is, which is ethereal almost. So you just give a dimension to that character, because we are all of that. We are what we think we are, what others think we are, and what we really are. Who knows what we really are?
And that's the beauty and artistry of acting, right? Because it's like a pathway out of that frame of thinking. Because when you're acting, you're just acting. You're clearly not yourself. You're just acting. You're playing a role. And it allows you to completely escape the normal thoughts that you may have. And now just embrace, acting and being a different person through a character. And I bet there are a lot of benefits in doing that. And I love the philosophical route that we've gotten ourselves into here. And which person do you think we should embody more? Like the person we really are, the person others see us as? Which of these do you think is better if we had to choose one? Or this is just a natural way of experiencing our consciousness and we should not really resist it so much and just embrace it because that's just the way it is?
I think we're all of those, and we need to be aware of that. So if one takes more weight, like I have to be aware, or it's good for me to be aware of what others may think of me. Now I make the decision of letting that influence me one way or another, right? I have to be able to put boundaries and limits and say, well, I can see how others see me this way, but I will take into consideration people that I love versus people that I don't know. And I have to decide whether I care or not what they think. And that's when our self-judgment comes into place, right? And that's when this sense of ridicule that I don't know in Argentina but I know in Spain, there's this huge sense of ridicule to speak English. And it's like taking those layers out. It's like just dive into the pool. And what I try to tell my students, like, I'm going to fill the pool with water. Don't worry. I'm not going to push you into an empty pool. Just give me the benefit of the doubt and know that there's water there and that I'm teaching you how to swim. And when that is broken, when the student finally gives me the benefit of the doubt and enters, that's when progress begins.
I love that metaphor. I also usually use it to illustrate the fear that we sometimes feel when it comes to speaking English. I don't usually say like the pool is empty. I'll say that, well, the student can see, the learner can see that there's water down there. But you know you're going to be all right if you throw yourself into the pool. You can see the water down there. But still, you need to take that leap of faith. Trust that you're going to be all right because you know you'll be all right. You just need to take action regardless and suspend any feeling of what if. No, there's no what if. Take action, you'll do it. Everything's going to be all right. And yeah, you'll come out better after you've gone through that experience of overcoming that fear. And while we're on the topic of fear and confidence as its counterpart, I want to get your thoughts on how can acting and maybe just introduce this idea of improvising too, which I think is part of your repertoire of skills for acting. At some point you deviate from the lines and you start improvising, I suppose, right? I would love to just get your thoughts on how can improvising help you with your fluency skills in English.
Okay. So improvisation is a technique that it takes a lot of work. To be spontaneous takes a lot of practice. It's like an oxymoron, right?
Yeah.
But it is. It's a great tool because it pushes you to not overthink. It pushes you to speak right away from your emotion. And when you don't do that, when you don't overthink, you stop judging. You let the natural you come with whatever you have there. So you have 3 basic words in English and you don't know any more. That's fine. You are put in a scenario and you have to get by with those 3 words. And when you have the need to do it, you certainly do. And you discover within yourselves, like, oh my God, I can't believe I did that. But that's what I did because I didn't know how. So it helps your brain think fast and then use the language. It's almost therapeutic when you let yourself be in an improvisation setting. It's really quite eye-opening.
You know, spontaneity takes practice. Love that oxymoron. And it's true, right? Like just explained there. You don't get to be spontaneous for free. You need to gain a lot of experience, I would say, right? Now, having said that, would you agree, Karolina, that it'd be highly beneficial if an English learner goes to improv class?
Always. There's even improv, and the target of the improv is not the language learning necessarily, like you said, right? Like it is a byproduct, and you learned little resources to, or little techniques. Like, I mean, we even did improvisations in gibberish. You know what gibberish is? You speak gibberish, you're just making up what you speak. So I don't know, and you have a conversation that has to do with your melody, your intonation, your rhythm, and you are communicating and you don't know really what the words say, but you know what the person means, which actually proves that 2 people communicate always. It's only when one doesn't want to then communication doesn't happen. But language is not the barrier.
So true. So absolutely true. And that places the focus so much not on our words, but rather on our body language and on our energy, the energy that we put out, right? Of course, words are important and they're what help us communicate with precision. But the bulk of what we say might not be just on our words, on the surface level of course, what we're saying. That's the precise, the accurate thing. But communication is really broad and, body language, right?
It is, which is why I like also to use comedy and humor, because humor is a cultural aspect, right? And it has to do with intonation, reading between the lines, sarcasm, so that the literal meaning of the words is not necessarily the ultimate meaning. And when you learn comedy and humor in another language, you are understanding a lot of the cultural aspects and how those people communicate. So, and you have fun. So, which goes into your emotions and is going to you're going to remember it more, you're going to embrace it more. So, yeah.
Totally. And, going back to this idea of improv and whether an English learner should go to improv class or not. And I asked you that. I knew you were going to say absolutely yes. And I also think that. So English hero out there, if teachers. You have the opportunity, and teachers as well, of course, English teachers. So if you have the opportunity to go to improv class, by all means, jump on that opportunity, even if it's not in English and it's in your native language, which I think might be the case if you're living in your country, in your own country, in your own home country, right? More likely that you're going to find places where they do improv in that language, of course, right? But even if that's the case, I think you should go for it regardless, because I think improv, the art of improvisation, goes deeper than the surface where language is, whether that's Spanish or your native language or English or any other language. Improvising involves a lot more like the emotions and like your spontaneity, being in the moment, thinking on your feet. It's more like an attitude or like a predisposition. So if you go to improv class in Spanish or in French or in whatever your native language is, I think it ultimately affects your English in a positive way as well.
It's like going to the gym for language, because you're doing brain gymnastics with it and you're learning how to communicate. It's a communication class, really, and communication is universal. Language is their codes, but communication goes beyond words.
Yeah, you've got to go to the gym. Exercise those English muscles and, muscles, body language, and nonverbal communication, Karolina. So you would say that body language, nonverbal communication is essential for mastering communication as a whole?
Yeah, nonverbal communication is key. Part of my background, although I did study Shakespeare and the words, I ended up doing a lot of physical theater. So there were nonverbal plays. And through these nonverbal performances, you can communicate an immense amount of emotion. Of course, that you cannot go into philosophical, itty-bitty details, right? And of course, you need words for that. But nonverbal communication is key. We forget about it. I think we teachers forget about it. We go into these grammar rules and into the words and into memorizing all of this. And we forget the nonverbal aspect of communication. And it's key, for sure.
Absolutely. And this tendency to focus so much on grammar And in the process of doing that, neglecting other opportunities to master the language, grammar itself, but also other aspects of the language. And I think that when you experience a linguistic situation in its full form, it's a conversation, there's body language involved, there is feelings, sensations, the context, the broad context. I think when you hear someone say something and they use a certain grammar pattern, then you're much better equipped to retain that because of all the extra information in the form of the other senses that you are taking in versus just seeing that same grammar pattern in a page on a piece of paper devoid of any other contextual, multisensory information. And so it's just learning something in isolation, which at some point maybe it might be useful in some situation where you just want to check or, get reminded about a certain point of grammar. But for like the broader learning and acquiring the language, the verdict is we just over-index on grammar teaching and we just neglect all the other opportunities that we have at our disposal to acquire the language.
This is why also I think task-based learning is it's really key, and it's really important to apply in learning a second language, and not necessarily drawing the class or having the focus on a grammar term, and then from there your class is planned, right? Rather than start from, I'm going to teach my students the present perfect. No, maybe I'm going to teach my students, or I'm going to work with my students on a common task to create a presentation for a city council, for a cultural center. And in that, we are going to be using the present perfect, I am sure. So when those uses come to place, all I have to do as a teacher is pinpoint them so they make those connections, and only for those students who need them. That is, I think the adult brain, once we have, of course, our L1 well learned, and also learned the grammar rules of our mother here I'm stuttering, of our mother tongue. Sometimes we need those explanations to make those parallel comparisons with that language, right? So we say, no, in English, every time we say an order, we use the infinitive without this or without that. But in Spanish, we use the gerund. And you go, okay. Okay, you made that connection. But some people don't work like that. They don't make the connection with the explanation of the rule. They just make it by the usage and the need to carry out a task. So this is why task-based learning, I think it encompasses everything.
Yeah, totally. And I guess as a learner or as a teacher, one should always question things, question methods, question well-established practices, and have an open mind and be open to experimenting with new ideas, new ways, new methods. You can pioneer a certain way of teaching English or learning English. Don't just settle for whatever the status quo is. Anyway, great, Karolina. So for the English learner, English hero out there who wants to learn more about you and follow you more closely, what's a place that you'd like to direct them to? What are some links or places that they can check out?
Well, they can visit my Instagram account at English with Miss Karolina, or they can visit our website. My husband Kevin and I have a website that is englishwithus.es.
There you go. So English Hero, waste no time and check out Karolina's stuff on Instagram, her website. I'm following you, Karolina, on LinkedIn, and I've seen some of the videos that you create, and they're so hilarious, so funny, great dialogue, great humor. Love the funny sketches.
Oh, thank you. They're fun. They're fun to make. They're a lot of work. but they're fun. They're fun to make.
Yeah, I can imagine they're a lot of work. So before hitting record today, I asked you if you had any questions about the conversation and about the last question that I always ask my guests, which is just I invite them to ask a powerful, thought-provoking question so that our audience thinks and reflects on the answer to that question. Better questions lead to better answers. And you recommended a book, right, that I had never heard of before, which is Asking Better Questions. And so I'm curious about that, and I'll be checking that out soon. And that said, you're now the perfect person to take on this challenge to ask a good question so that our audience can reflect on that. So, Karolina, what would you like to leave our English heroes with today? The floor is yours.
I guess it has more to do, it's not about language. Like we talked, like all this interview, I think it was more about mindset. I guess I would ask, what are you willing to let go in order to become more fluent in English? What are you willing to, yeah. It's more about what you are willing to do to obtain that goal, to get there, because as teachers also, like, I cannot learn for you. I can only guide you. And learning is teaching and learning is a two-way street. Communication is a two-way street.
What are you willing to let go of
in order to become more fluent in English?
There's so much wisdom in letting go. All right, so Karolina, really appreciate you and thank you again for coming on the show. I think you've brought tremendous value today and I am forever grateful for you doing that today. Thank you.
Oh, well, back at you. I am very grateful that you had me as guest here and I commend you immensely on this project of the podcast and all the work that you do. There's a lot of work behind something always, the ballerina jumping and you think, oh, that's easy. There's a lot of work behind. So the easier it looks, the harder it is. And you make it look easy. So
the tip of the iceberg, right? Thank you, Karolina. It's been great. All right, so there you go, folks. I hope that you enjoyed that chat, that conversation with Carolina Ramos as much as I did, and just reflecting a little bit on that time with Karolina. I think this was one of the most interesting conversations I've had on the podcast so far. It's definitely the one that left me thinking, wow, that was really interesting. Because as I said in the intro of this podcast, theater and acting are things that, well, they're not part of my life. It's not something that I've ever dedicated myself to. And yeah, I just don't think about it, but it just made me realize that it's just a fantastic way to connect, that activity, acting, theater, with English, provided that you can actually express yourself in English as you're acting or engaging in theater or in performing and things like that. But also, I should probably follow my own advice and take improv classes or even go to acting lessons, even if they're not in English, because there's still a lot to learn from doing that and just, have to do with your ability to express yourself, to perform, to even just do something that's outside of your comfort zone. I also said in the beginning that even if acting is not your thing, this was a worthwhile conversation even for you, because at the end of the day, it's about what acting and theater unlocks, which is feeling, moving, emotions, full body expression. And there are many things that can also unlock those things. Maybe they're not going to be as effective as theater or acting, but still, the point is that you connect your English with something that you're passionate about. If I ever wanted to take a course, an online course on basketball, I would probably do it in English, not in Spanish, my native language, just so that I can, just continue living by this value that I connect the things that I love with English because that's just how I like to do it. I just find it more fun and just prefer it that way. So if that's something that you could see yourself doing, well, go ahead and do it. Connect the things that you love with English. Anyway, now I just want to thank you for listening or watching this episode. If you've enjoyed it, which I might think that you have, that's why you've made it this far into the podcast, I would please ask you to rate this podcast with a 5-star rating on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or any of the other platform places where you're tuning in from. Give us a 5-star review. That helps tremendously. And if you're watching on YouTube, subscribe, follow, like this video, and yeah, just give us some love. Also leave a comment down below while you're at it. So with that said, that's a wrap for today. And as always, keep learning, keep growing, keep living your English, and until next time.